This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 733 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's Sleeper Show was better than the Week 15 one. The streaming quarterback picks were really solid. Gardner Minshew and Sam Darnold were top 8 options at the position, and Brock Purdy ranked as the QB 13, so overall I'm happy with that. Tyler Algier continued producing, Taysom Hill and Noah Fant were fine enough tight end streamers, and Isaiah Hodgins had a monster day against the Vikings. He was the wide receiver 7 last week in PPR formats. But there were some big misses too. I really thought that Marquise Goodwin was a decent play. He did absolutely nothing. Demarcus Robinson scored, but it was his only catch of the game. Mac Hollins did nothing in that bad weather game against the Steelers, and the deeper tight end streamers, they weren't very good either. So it wasn't a bad week, but it wasn't a top week. Hopefully I can finish on top this week because it's the final sleeper show of the season. Now before getting into the Week 17 sleepers, I wanted to let you know that the Week 17 NFL Sunday Million is officially live on FanDuel. Showcase your NFL knowledge and construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap, then follow along using FanDuel's live scoring feature to compete for your share of $1 million in cash prizes, including a cool $200,000 first place prize, all for just $5. Sunday is approaching quickly, so head to FanDuel and submit your lineups today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. This first tier consists of players who are rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and I'll begin with my favorite quarterback streamer of the week. That's Brock Purdy. I talked about Purdy on the 15 Transaction Show this week, and while there is some regression coming his way statistically, it's not like he's playing poorly, and it's not like he has bad weapons, and it's not like he's not facing the second best matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted points allowed this week. The 49ers get the Raiders. Vegas has been very kind to quarterbacks all season long. With an implied team total above 25 points, Purdy's a safe option to at least give you some sort of a floor this week, which is sort of what he's done since he took over that job. Now, another guy I mentioned on that 15 Transaction Show is Gardner Minshew. He works as well. I do have a little worry that we won't see the same back and forth action that we saw last week in Dallas, but Minshew still works. He had the 6th highest average depth of target last week across the NFL, and on paper, New Orleans is a top half matchup for quarterbacks. Like I said, though, I don't know if the same ceiling is going to be there in this matchup. The Saints can't move the ball like the Cowboys can, and they actually have allowed the lowest completion rate on 15-plus air yard throws this year, so it may be more difficult for the Eagles to generate big plays down the field. Regardless, Philly has a good implied team total, so if Minshew does end up starting again this week, he should be fine. And then Mike White is back too, and I think that he works as a streamer. The Jets have a reasonable implied team total according to FanDuel Sportsbook at 22.5. Seattle's the 11th best matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed. They've been a defense that's allowed only maybe one monster performance this year, which was Jared Goff back in week 4. But quarterbacks are consistently scoring 17, 18 fantasy points on them. And White himself has been fine as a starter, especially in plus matchups. During his first 2 starts of the season, he faced the Bears and the Vikings. He was a top 10 quarterback in both of those matchups. He only scored 11 fantasy points against Buffalo, but that's a much tougher matchup than the one that he'll see this weekend. So if you want to go with Mike White, that makes plenty of sense. Zach Moss is still well below that 50% threshold, and he's been seeing pretty good usage in that Colts offense. We didn't know how they'd divvy up that backfield entering Week 16, but Moss played 70% of the team's offensive snaps, and he handled a really high 92% of the team's running back rushes. He only had a 4% target share, but he ran by far the most routes among Colts running backs. And keep in mind, that was in a game where Indy largely faced a negative game script. They ran 31 offensive plays while trailing and 21 plays while trailing by 10 or more points. They get the Giants this week. It's a totally average matchup on paper. Moss is seeing volume, and that should be good enough to be a potential flex play. Now, before I talk about this next guy, I've got to take a giant L. A couple of weeks ago on the 15 Transactions episode, I talked about dropping Deontay Foreman in shallower leagues. They were coming off a terrible game against Pittsburgh, and the Panthers had the Lions and Buccaneers up next. 2 teams that can stop the run. But the Panthers committed to the run once again, and they absolutely destroyed Detroit on the ground in Week 16. So it was bad advice from me. And I don't hide when I'm wrong. I was wrong. That should have never been a transaction, even if it was focused on more shallower leagues. With that being said, Foreman's teammate got it done last week too. Chuba Hubbard saw just 33% of the team's running back rushes, but he ran the ball 12 times for 125 yards. Now, the annoying part about his week 16 was that he failed to see a target. In his 2 games prior, Hubbard had a 15% and 16% target share. Hopefully, we see a little bit more of that this week. The Buccaneers are not an easy matchup, but the Panthers are running the ball really, really well under Steve Wilks. And that's more important than the matchup itself. So Hubbard's definitely a sleeper. I'm not sure you're going to have to dig this deep in a championship matchup, but even though Khalil Herbert didn't do that much in his return this past week, there are some peripheral numbers that were encouraging. First off, he only saw 27% of the team's running back rushes. That number had been closer to 50% before his injury. So that's not great, but it was also his first game back. Herbert actually played 41% of Chicago's offensive snaps, and he only ran 7 fewer routes than David Montgomery. That ended up resulting in a 12% target share. Now the Bears get the Lions in a game with the highest over-under this week on FanDuel Sportsbook. So it's a great environment for a player who had better secondary numbers than people probably realized last week. Now at wide receiver, Jahan Dotson has been lighting it up. He's another player I talked about on Tuesday's show, but man, he's been crushing. He's been a top 18 wide receiver in weekly scoring in each of his last 3, and he's seen target shares of 22.5%, 22.2%, and 26.5% during this time. I'm not overly concerned about this switch from Taylor Heineke to Carson Wentz. Dotson was doing fine with Wentz to start the year, and that's usually a part of a rookie wide receiver season where there's less production. If anything, the scarier splits are with Terry McLaurin. But yeah, Dotson's numbers are so strong right now that you have to consider him in week 17, even if the matchup is not perfect. I will say though, wide receiver is pretty tough this week. It's hard to find decent enough wide receivers off the waiver wire to use in your championship matchup. But Russell Gage has seen 18 targets over his last 2 games. He had a 12.5% target share this past week. That's not great, but it was over 28% the week prior. And he's playing more than twice as many snaps as Julio Jones. The Panthers are a top 5 matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed, so he at least makes a little bit of sense. Now, at the time of this recording, I'm not sure if Christian Watson's going to play this week or not. If he doesn't, then Romeo Doubs is a really strong play against the Vikings. He played as the number 2 wide receiver after Watson went down last week, and he's now seen an 18% and 16% target share over his last 2, the 2 games he's played since returning from injury. Minnesota's secondary has been torched this year. They're a top matchup for wide receivers and adjusted fantasy points allowed, and Green Bay is currently sitting with an implied team total very close to 25 points. So Doubs is a really good option if Watson can't go. If Watson does go, I still think there's opportunity for Doubs to have a good day. Now at tight end, Greg Dulcich saw a 23.5% target share last week. Over his last 4, he's seen target shares of 38%, 19%, 8%, and then last week at 24%. The last time the Broncos faced the Chiefs, Dulcich walked away with 8 targets and 7.2 PPR points. In what should be a negative game script for Denver once again, he's a pretty good play. And then Tyler Conklin can work this week as well. He's facing the absolute best matchup in football in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, and while he's only seen target shares of 6% and 13% over his last 2, in Mike White starts, Conklin's target shares have been 11%, 13%, and 18%. You want to target tight ends against Seattle, and this week, it's Tyler Conklin's turn. Now we'll move on to players who are rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. So these are your deep sleepers of the week. And I'm going to start this off with a little trivia question. Since week 12, do you know which quarterback among relevant starters leads the NFL in yards per attempt? I'll give you a second. It's Sam freaking Darnold. Since Darnold returned to action, he's been really, really efficient. The Panthers have been great running the football, but Darnold's been good through the air, and he's averaging just about 16 fantasy points per game. Do I love him this week? No, not totally. The Buccaneers are an average to below average matchup, and this game has a sub 40 point over under. I would play the 3 other quarterbacks I talked about earlier over Darnold this week. But for a sub 10% roster quarterback, he's not the worst play in the world. Joshua Kelly's been seeing work in this Chargers offense. He's tallied 19 carries over his last 2 games, and he's seen 3 targets too. His running back rush share over his last 2 is close to 40%. This week, the Chargers are 6.5 point favorites against the Rams. If they hit a positive game script, don't be surprised to see Kelly get more work, especially since the Chargers have locked up a wildcard spot. They can move up and down a spot, but they may want to take it easy on a player like Austin Eckler. So I think Kelly could see a decent amount of work this week. Royce Freeman is still barely rostered across all fantasy formats, and I get it. He's probably not going to be this league winner this week. But he's seen 11 and 16 carries over his last 2 games, and he saw his snap share rise to 57% this past week. Now he gets an average matchup against Jacksonville. So I think he's a high floor, low ceiling option here in week 17. Now, I'm not very optimistic about it, but you could look at Rashid Shaheed this week. He's played about 30% of his snaps from the slot this year, and the slot is generally how wide receivers win against Philadelphia. The Eagles have actually seen the lowest percentage of targets go to perimeter wide receivers this season. They're also a bottom half defense for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. It's just that Shaheed could see some volume if the Saints hit a negative game script. He had a 36% target share this past week without Chris Olave in the mix, and it was 21% the week prior. So Shaheed could be the guy once again. Isaiah Hodgins is also still rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues. His matchup against the Colts isn't nearly as good as his matchup last week against the Vikings, but Hodgins is averaging a 20% target share per game over his last 4. And he's coming off last week's game where he had a 27% target share. It's hard to find that volume in this group of players. And then the only tight end that I've got in this tier is on that same team. It's Daniel Bellinger. I know I've talked about Bellinger a lot on this show, but when we're talking lower tiered tight ends, we're looking for general participation. And Bellinger has that. He ran the most routes at tight end last week across the entire league. He gets a below average matchup this week against the Colts, but he at least has a shot to see some volume. But I will say I'd rather play Greg Dulcich or Tyler Conklin over Bellinger this week. Now at defense here in week 17, you could go with the Chargers against the Rams. I know the Rams had a good outing last week, but in their 2 other games with Baker Mayfield, the Packers and Raiders were fine defenses for fantasy purposes. The Chargers are big favorites in a game with a low over-under, and they've played well defensively of late too, so they work. I also don't mind Miami against New England, though I think that's sort of a deeper play. And I like Jacksonville against Houston too, and I talked about Detroit against Chicago on the 15 Transaction Show. But then there's the Giants. I really like the Giants this week against Nick Foles. We saw how bad the Colts were offensively in week 16, and the Giants have one of the top pressure rates in the league. So I think it could be a long day for the Colts offense. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Before I go, I want to just thank everyone who was along for the ride this year. I truly, truly love doing this. My job as an analyst, this show, and I hope that you were able to get something out of this podcast this season, even if you didn't win your league's fantasy title. If your process improved, if you were able to finish higher than you usually do, if you just felt more comfortable playing fantasy football, that's a win. I won't be going anywhere this offseason. I will be taking a couple of weeks off from the show to work on some things and regroup a little bit, but I feel like off-season content is almost more important than in-season content. I do studies throughout the offseason. I talk prospects throughout the offseason. I get to sit back and dig into the fun game theory things that I love to dig into. So I'm really excited for all that, and I hope you guys are too. So thanks again for an awesome season, and go win some fantasy championships. Take care, everyone.